He once turned a serious performance review into an elaborate Die Hard reference, complete with sound effects, rather than simply sitting still and hearing what his captain actually had to say about his work. Not because he didn't care about the feedback, because taking anything seriously in front of someone whose opinion actually mattered to him meant risking a kind of disappointment he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. Jake Peralta never needed to be the class clown. He needed a reason to never fully grow up and risk failing at it. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to quote entire bits verbatim, and for years I laughed at Jake the same way everyone does, the brilliant but immature detective who can't take anything seriously, allergic to authority and responsibility alike. But you don't just see a talented cop who happens to love pop culture references. You see a man who learned early that growing up, trusting people, expecting them to stay, wasn't safe, and who built an entire identity out of staying just immature enough to never risk that disappointment fully. By the end of this video, every joke Jake Peralta has ever made in a serious moment is going to sound a lot less like comic relief, and a lot more like a boy still bracing for someone to leave. There's a term for what Jake does. Psychologists describe arrested development as a pattern where someone remains emotionally fixed at an earlier developmental stage, often adolescence, avoiding the responsibilities and vulnerabilities that come with full adult commitment because an earlier disappointment made growing up feel unsafe. It isn't simple immaturity for its own sake. It's a specific strategy. If you never fully commit to being a serious adult, taken seriously by people who matter, you never have to risk the particular disappointment of failing at it, or being left by someone once you did. Jake doesn't make jokes because he lacks depth. He makes them because staying just immature enough has always felt safer than fully showing up. Jake's father, Roger, left the family when Jake was young, and the show returns repeatedly to the specific, ongoing disappointment of a man who shows up sporadically, makes big promises, and reliably fails to follow through on them. Each reappearance offers Jake a fresh dose of hope, followed by a fresh version of the same letdown well into Jake's adulthood. That pattern doesn't just create sadness. It creates a very specific lesson about commitment itself, that adults who promise to stay, to follow through, to be reliable, often simply aren't. If the person who was supposed to model adult responsibility for you kept failing at it, adulthood itself starts to look less like a milestone worth reaching and more like a role that inevitably ends in letting someone down. That association, growing up equals eventually disappointing the people who depend on you, becomes the quiet engine behind nearly every instance of Jake avoiding real responsibility elsewhere in his life. Jake's mother, Karen, raised him largely alone after Roger's departure, providing stability and love, but also, understandably, carrying her own frustration and disappointment about the marriage that visibly colors how she discusses Roger, and by extension, adult relationships in general, around her son. Growing up primarily with one parent's perspective on why adult commitment fails doesn't just shape Jake's view of romance. It shapes his broader relationship to seriousness itself. If the adults around him modeled adult responsibility mainly through disappointment and unmet promises, staying playful, staying uncommitted, starts to look like the safer alternative to becoming another example of someone who let people down. That inherited caution around commitment follows Jake directly into the one place he actually does show real dedication: police work, where his humor becomes both a genuine skill and a convenient shield. Jake's constant references to Die Hard aren't simply a comedic quirk. They represent an idealized fantasy of masculine competence and heroism, a world where a flawed but fundamentally good man saves the day decisively without the messy, ongoing emotional labor that real adult relationships actually require. That fantasy offers Jake something his own father never modeled: a clear, satisfying resolution where being a hero doesn't require sustained vulnerability, just a single decisive moment of competence. Real relationships, real commitment, don't offer that clean narrative arc. They require ongoing trust, repeated small efforts, exactly the kind of sustained follow-through Jake watched his own father repeatedly fail to provide. Retreating into that fictional ideal lets Jake experience heroism without risk, a rehearsal space for competence that never actually demands the vulnerability his real relationships eventually will. Captain Holt becomes, gradually and almost accidentally, the stable father figure Jake never had, someone who takes Jake's talent seriously, holds him to genuinely high standards, and remains reliably, consistently present in a way Roger never managed. Their relationship develops slowly, built on earned respect rather than easy affection. What makes Holt's influence so significant is precisely that he doesn't tolerate Jake's deflecting humor as a permanent substitute for real growth. He pushes back, expects more, and stays anyway, modeling something Jake has never fully experienced. An authority figure whose expectations don't disappear the moment Jake falls short of them. That steady, demanding presence becomes one of the clearest catalysts for Jake's gradual willingness to take real commitment seriously, first professionally, and eventually in the relationship that would challenge his arrested development most directly. Jake's relationship with Amy develops from workplace rivalry into the show's central romance, and notably, it's one of the only relationships where Jake's usual deflecting humor consistently isn't enough to sustain intimacy. Amy expects genuine partnership, real emotional availability, the kind of follow-through Jake has spent his whole adult life avoiding. Their relationship becomes a direct test of everything Jake learned from his father. Amy doesn't just want the fun, joke-cracking version of Jake. She wants a partner who shows up during the hard, unglamorous parts too, exactly the sustained commitment Roger never modeled. Jake's growth throughout the series is measured largely by his gradual willingness to be that person, however uncomfortable it is for someone whose entire identity was built around avoiding it. That growth doesn't happen instantly, and it's tested repeatedly by the other relationships in his life that still pull him back toward his old avoidant patterns. Jake's friendship with Charles, dating back to their police academy days, is defined by Charles's intense, almost overwhelming devotion, a loyalty so complete it occasionally becomes its own source of comedy. What makes the friendship significant, though, is that Charles offers Jake something rare, total acceptance regardless of how immature or reckless Jake behaves. That unconditional quality is comforting, but it's also, in its own way, an enabling force. Charles rarely challenges Jake to grow the way Holt or Amy eventually do. He simply accepts him exactly as he already is, which means the friendship, however genuine, doesn't push Jake toward the same kind of development his romantic relationship eventually requires. It's a friendship built on total loyalty rather than growth, and it highlights, by contrast, exactly how much more Amy and Holt ask of Jake than his oldest friend ever does. Jake's partnership with Rosa is built on mutual respect and a shared, if differently expressed, discomfort with vulnerability. Rosa's own guardedness rarely challenges Jake to open up emotionally, but their partnership does model something valuable. Two people who trust each other completely on the job, even while both remain privately reluctant to discuss feelings directly. That professional trust, built through consistent reliability in high-stakes situations, becomes a kind of proof for Jake that competence and dependability are things he's actually capable of sustaining, at least at work. It's a controlled environment where the stakes of failure are clear and the rules are known, considerably safer territory than the uncertain, ongoing vulnerability real romantic commitment requires. That contrast, reliable at work, avoidant in relationships, becomes especially visible once you examine the broader professional culture Jake was trained inside of. To understand Jake fully, it helps to understand the specific cultural moment that shaped his idea of heroism. The action films of the 1980s and 1990s, Die Hard chief among them, popularized a very particular masculine ideal: competent, wisecracking, emotionally contained heroes who solve enormous problems through decisive action rather than sustained emotional labor. For a boy without a reliable father figure at home, that cinematic ideal offered an appealing substitute blueprint for what a good man looks like, one built entirely around single, dramatic moments of competence rather than the quieter, ongoing follow-through real relationships require. Jake didn't just enjoy these movies as entertainment. He absorbed them as an alternate model for manhood, one considerably easier to embody than the sustained vulnerability his actual life demanded. That cultural template explains why Jake's growth throughout the series often looks like learning to trade cinematic heroism for the much less glamorous, much harder version, showing up consistently in the unremarkable moments nobody's writing a movie about. There's a second layer of context worth examining. American police culture has long emphasized stoicism, gallows humor, and emotional detachment as professional norms, coping mechanisms developed partly in response to genuinely difficult and traumatic work, but which also discourage open vulnerability among officers more broadly. Jake's precinct culture rewards exactly the kind of deflecting humor he already relies on personally, giving him professional cover for a coping mechanism he'd already developed at home. Cracking jokes under pressure isn't just Jake's individual quirk. It's an accepted, even valued, survival skill within his specific workplace culture, one that inadvertently reinforces his personal avoidance of more direct emotional expression. That overlap between his personal history and his professional environment explains why Jake's humor rarely gets challenged as a problem at work, even as it becomes a genuine obstacle in his more intimate relationships. Terry Jeffords serves as a steady, disciplined presence at the precinct, a devoted family man whose own approach to responsibility offers Jake a quieter, less flashy model of adult commitment than either Holt's authority or Amy's direct expectations. Terry doesn't lecture Jake about growing up. He simply demonstrates consistently what balancing genuine care with professional competence actually looks like day to day. That modeling matters because it shows Jake a version of adulthood that doesn't require abandoning humor or personality entirely. Terry is still recognizably himself, still capable of warmth and even playfulness, while also being completely reliable in ways Jake's own father never managed. It's proof that responsibility and personality aren't mutually exclusive, a distinction Jake's childhood never quite modeled for him. Jake's unlikely, ongoing friendship with Doug Judy, a charming career criminal he's arrested multiple times, offers a strange but revealing dynamic. Despite being adversaries professionally, the two share a genuine mutual affection and respect, built partly on their shared love of style, wit, and a certain playful disregard for convention. That friendship lets Jake experience a version of connection with minimal real stakes attached. Doug will always eventually get arrested again. The relationship exists in a kind of consequence-free bubble, fun and genuine, but never requiring the sustained, high-stakes commitment his relationship with Amy demands. It's a safe rehearsal space for connection, similar in some ways to his relationship with fictional action heroes, enjoyable, real in its own way, but ultimately lower stakes than the vulnerability his actual adult life increasingly requires of him. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Captain Holt, the one everyone frames as the rigid, emotionally reserved authority figure, simply trying to whip Jake into shape. He's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needed Jake's specific brand of chaotic warmth just as much as Jake needed his steady discipline. Think about it. Holt spent years of his career overlooked and underestimated by an institution reluctant to fully recognize him, professionally guarded in ways that left little room for open affection or playfulness. Jake, whatever his flaws, offers Holt something rare, genuine, unguarded admiration and warmth, delivered without any of the political caution Holt had to maintain with almost everyone else around him for most of his career. So the captain everyone assumes was simply mentoring an immature detective out of professional obligation turns out to have been quietly starved for exactly the kind of open, unguarded loyalty Jake offered him from the very beginning, long before either man fully admitted how much the relationship actually meant to him personally. What Jake deserved, back before his father's repeated disappearances, taught him that adult commitment always ends badly, was proof that showing up consistently doesn't automatically end in someone leaving. Not a die-hard reference deployed the moment something real got too close. Not a performance review turned into a joke before he had to sit with actual feedback. What he actually received was a lifetime of watching one adult after another fail to follow through, until staying just immature enough felt like the only way to avoid becoming another disappointment himself. He built an entire personality out of never fully growing up, so failure could never quite catch him fully formed. He built it so well, He nearly missed the people patiently waiting for him to risk it anyway. And in Amy's steady expectation, in Holt's quiet, earned trust, in the moment Jake finally showed up fully, without a single joke to hide behind, that was the boy still waiting for his father, finally quietly, discovering that staying was actually possible. The jokes were never about the jokes. They never were. So was Jake Peralta simply immature or a man terrified of becoming his father? Neither, honestly. Jake wasn't a naturally undisciplined man who happened to love pop culture, and he wasn't a fully grown man merely performing immaturity for laughs. He was someone who turned one repeated childhood disappointment into an entire identity built around never risking that particular failure again, because staying playful always felt safer than becoming another adult who let someone down. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person who refuses to grow up isn't avoiding responsibility itself. He's avoiding the specific moment he might finally resemble the person who once let him down. So here's what I want to know. If Jake's father had actually stayed and followed through, do you think he still becomes a man who deflects every serious moment with a joke? Or was that fear always going to find him somewhere, one way or another? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.